Welcome to the Legal Selva podcast.
Hi, good afternoon. Today I'm talking with Kate Russell. Kate is an HR professional, having spent decades in various areas of her alcove, including talent acquisition, team building, diversity inclusion, HR leadership, I believe in both the banking and the tech industry. In addition, Kate is a very good friend of mine, so I'm excited to talk with her today. Kate, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Cool. How's your day going so far?
It's going very well, thank you. Summer's here, so no complaints.
No complaints. Are you mostly working from home or do you go into the office?
I am. I have the privilege of working from home most of the time, although we have a beautiful office in Toronto at Microsoft, and I travel as well to various locations since my role is global. So it's kind of the best of all worlds.
Cool. Let's break that down a little bit. So what is your current position? Because I know that you've been involved in various different parts of HR.
Yeah, right now I'm an HR director on our HR for HR team at Microsoft. And so essentially that involves building one's own HR function for the company, which is a pretty neat spot to be. And the team that I'm currently partnered with is the commercial HR organization for Microsoft, as well as a portion of our geo HR teams.
Okay, I think we have to break that down a lot.
Of course.
So you said building our own HR.
That's right. I'm an HR business partner for a chunk of our HR team, meaning my primary accountabilities are organizational health, leadership team development and performance, and talent management for the chunk of the business that I partner with. So think their structure, their operations, their people plan, such that they can realize the goals that they're tasked with.
So you provide all of the support for I guess I don't want to say the smaller HR departments, but if you picture it like a tree, like all the little limbs, you support the HR of each of the limbs. Is that correct?
I would say that's true. I think to break it down even a little bit further, the HR business partner role is more consultative at our senior leadership layer, and we also have some HR teams that do some of the more operational support underneath. So I need to build a better HR team, to put it plainly, for our commercial business at Microsoft.
Cool. Talent acquisition and people placing.
Talent management versus less so hiring, more so developing, promoting, slotting of talent
moving
with the right
around.
Profiles and moving people around. Exactly right.
Okay. I think I understand about 5% of that.
That's all right.
Well, I think a lot of people listening aren't in HR whatsoever. So, we put out a position. Hi, we need a law clerk to work in our real estate department. This is what we're looking for. We review some resumes, make some interviews, and that's kind of, I think, the extent that the average person listening is going to have. I appreciate for larger companies, it's very, very different.
And heavily matrixed. Yeah,
heavily matrixed. Can you talk a bit about some of your current projects?
Happy to.
Cool.
So a couple of things currently we're working on, because my client group supports our commercial business. They're currently located in over 60 countries around the world. And so as you can imagine, it's one Microsoft, but selling different things in different ways in all of those markets globally. And sometimes, depending on whatever the geopolitical landscape, the commercial landscape, a number of factors, we need a talent plan for HR people that's going to be the right level and profile of person to run the operation from a people perspective in those countries to get the best out of that market opportunity. So I would be working on a talent map of sorts that really looks at what are the relative size and scale of the market, what's our competitive landscape, what are some of the factors that we really want to use to accelerate our business performance in that area, and therefore what type of HR leader would probably be the best investment for us to make in that geography. So for this year, kind of a talent map that most closely aligns the work that we need done with the market that it's being done in, is an example of one project.
Cool. Do you find, so let's compare, and just an example, like you're setting this up in Spain versus you're setting this up in New Zealand. Do you find that you generally, your main people are native to, or at least have lived in those regions for a fair bit of time, so they're familiar with the culture, they have probably better connections? Is that true? Or do you see a lot of
I love that you asked that. That wasn't always true. And that is actually a critical part of our strategy because we've learned that country natives or geography natives, as you say, especially if they've lived and worked there for a long time, are attuned at how to drive specific outcomes within a culture that others less familiar might miss. So we would absolutely hire locals or at the very least international profiles of HR folks that have had those work experiences in those markets before to be most successful.
Yeah. Because it goes way beyond language. I've heard
Way
people say,
beyond language.
well, I can go work there because, I speak Spanish or I speak Italian, so I can work in these places. I've learned living in other places and kind of trying to develop my own awareness of language. You can speak the language even very well, but you can't speak the slang. And you don't understand some of the connotations to things unless you've really been there a long time.
A great example of what you're talking about is one of our critical core company missions is around diversity and inclusion. And those can be really sensitive conversations. They can be difficult outcomes to impact when you're trying to change maybe the demographic makeup of a part of the organization. And the people who are best positioned to know how to influence toward those types of outcomes are definitely people who with the deep intrinsic understanding of the culture, some of the barriers, and some of the norms that really help them to be more influential and effective in that market.
I know that you also have a background in diversity and inclusion, and on top of that, a passion for it, whether you're in the position or not. Have you always had that? Or is that something that developed prior to your HR experience, or something that you've just seen more and more in, the hiring and the human allocation?
I think I've always had it. I don't know that I was as well equipped to articulate it and impact it as I was before I went through my HR journey and have seen over the course of, I've been in HR about 20 years, just the focus and the conversation shift from the business case for D&I and why that makes sense to that was pretty much 10, 15 years ago to hopefully for a lot of companies to now is just how can we actually get in underneath some of the remaining injustice, imbalance, lack of equity, whatever you want to call it. And really just make tangible progress in terms of representation, yes, but also inclusion once you get diverse people, whatever that means to you in your company.
So explain to me a little bit on how you view inclusion, let's say inclusion post-hiring, because my understanding, inclusion is just, okay, I'm going to look at a whole bunch of resumes and I'm going to make sure that there's a bit of a matrix of the people that I at least interview and get to know better. But do you find there's a lot of work regarding inclusion once people are actually hired? So now you work here, there's no question that you're going to be here. Now, how do we assimilate you? Is that?
My point of view is there's more inclusion work after the hiring process than there was before. So all the things you mentioned are right, making sure you've got a diverse slate of candidates, ideally diverse people interviewing them. And diversity can be, yes, demographics, but also experiences you've had, places you've worked, all of that kind of stuff. And then once you've chosen a really great diverse candidate that's going to be additive to your culture because they bring something different that perhaps you don't have on the team, the real work is creating the safety for that person where they may be someone with a different take on things than the existing team might have. So you have to make sure to create the safety and in fact invite them into making their contributions when they might be something new that the rest of the team hasn't heard before, or they may feel like the sole person who hasn't had a certain experience or whatnot. And so that can be even harder than getting them in the door in the first place, is making sure they feel able to bring the true value of those contributions to the work that they're doing.
How do you do that without singling them out? Because that would always be my concern. Like, you don't want to bring someone in and be like, hey, everybody listen, now we have Mary here today, and everyone acknowledge that Mary's culture is different, Mary's background is different, things that Mary is able to add are different. If you're dealing with a disability, accommodations are different. Because if I were Mary, I wouldn't want to be singled out in that. I'd want to be included, but I wouldn't want to feel like everyone was bending over backwards to make sure that I was.
And what you're touching on is also this idea of tokenism, which is the problem with being the only whatever. If it's a factor that people can see about you that may be different, where we try to educate managers and ourselves in HR, quite frankly, in creating that kind of safety and inclusive experiences is if really the right answer is if you ask somebody who on a team is diverse, the answer is everybody, because there are a number of facets of people that you can't see, things that people don't tell you, things that we may assume about their identity or where they come from that may not be true. And so the best inclusive practices are things that everybody can practice in a group setting, specifically to create space for everybody, whether you're an introvert, you might be neurodiverse, whatever it is, that they sort of equals the playing fields for all contributors versus singling anyone out. Because you're absolutely right. As soon as you start to feel othered, it's kind of, I'm using air quotes, listeners can't see, it's sort of the kiss of death for inclusive practices as soon as you make somebody feel like they stick out in a way that they don't want to.
I acted as a general counsel for about the first 6 years of my practice. And around that time, I think it was Bill 136 or 138 had come in that dealt with harassment, the anti-bullying policy, and we really used that as, I'm going to say excuse for a company to say, well, it's not our fault. The government is requiring that we do this. The government is requiring, I know you've been here for 10 years and you're a good person, but the government is requiring that we update our policies and that we train you on it and that we have you sign off on it. And I remember taking seminars in that. And it was something that we, I think I found very effective because you outline all of this. So, you're not singling someone else for a physical disability or a cultural, inclination. But if you can forward think of all the possibilities that might come up and you put it in the policy, then it also let the managers kind of step away from being the bad guy in a way. It's like, well, no, this is what the company does. This is how the company operates. This is how, and you're a good person, so you appreciate that this is the nice and moral way to act. But in terms of having a general reference, I found updating your policy books all the time. I mean, I think there was one point where that was a good year of my life between 4 different companies.
I can only imagine, as for us, those kinds of things have been happening on a global scale, and we're seeing some jurisdictions even where they would have definitely gone through traditional employment law kind of considerations when you're talking about separation of someone or restructuring. And now we're seeing, just recently, I had an experience involving New Zealand where some of the questions that we are forced to or challenged by in terms of redundancy delve into, is that the best way to structure this team based on how you've defined their business purpose, which make you go, whoa, like that's not a sphere where traditionally I think we would be challenged to give that level of detail. But it's super interesting to see where certain jurisdictions take it.
I will admit that last little part was a little bit over my head because I don't work in this area a lot. When you are, and I appreciate we've talked about how, different roles, different positions, different locations really attract and require a different type of person. But if you are assessing candidates overall, whether it's, and I appreciate you said you don't do any hiring now, even though I think you probably have in the past, or moving around, say promoting and dealing in more senior positions. Are there any general things that stand out? You're like, oh, I like this, other than just a good feeling about the person?
Definitely. I would say some of the themes of the game are comfort operating in ambiguity, because the pace of change and speed at which you need to keep up with things, you need to really have incredible judgment in the face of ambiguity. And it's less about what you already know and more about how you go about learning what you need to know to solve a particular problem. So comfort and ambiguity, learning agility, ownership mindset, I would say. So rather than just, this is not my job, this is not what I do, connect the dots for whomsoever needs to be involved in the solution.
So that's like
Yeah,
your
those are-
initiative. So comfort and ambiguity.
Yeah. Learning agility.
I would think. I like the phrase of
Okay.
that one: comfort and ambiguity. So you're looking for someone who, without being given a very specific direction, like put the coffee mug on the desk. Is it probably as specific as you can get? Someone who you can be given like a general objective to say, this is what we want to accomplish. Give us some ideas on how to get there.
Well said. Here is the problem we're trying to solve.
Yeah.
Based on your expertise or things that you know, who should be part of that? How should we go about it based on whatever geography that you're doing this for? And even one step further to say, how can we already connect that to the system of solutions we may have so that we can let other people leverage it in the future if it's a really neat piece of work?
I think in the past, we always, at a non-HR professional level, we call that showing initiative.
That's fair too.
If someone who can stand up and be like, well, as opposed to just saying, hey, this is broken. This is broken, and I think we should do this to fix it, in that sort of way.
Yeah, initiative and the instincts to know which is the best problem you could go solve right now in service of the greater objective are huge.
Right.
For
So
sure.
prioritizing well.
Yep.
All of these things to me sound like something more if you're promoting someone, because you can't look at a resume. Someone's resume might say, I have great initiative. In fact, everybody's resume probably says, I have great initiative.
Pretty sure you're right.
Yeah. So from there, do you do a lot of reference checks, or
No, we
Not really?
found we don't offer them, and so we found while we do them, it's outsourced, and I find it's sort of more good for confirming technical information because these days
Right.
very few folks will give qualitative references.
Yep.
The way we more think about that is during interviews, and I have done a couple recently for selective positions. We use competency-based interview guides. So if you're
Okay,
looking
break
for
that down for me.
breaking it down means a certain set of questions, testing for a certain set of things that are important to that role. And it helps with the inclusive part because then the upside is you can ask every candidate for that position the exact same questions to be able to make a fair and unbiased assessment. So for example, recently we need a role like what I just described for you, growth mindset. So how do you embrace failure as essential to mastery and persevere in the face of setbacks and all of that kind of fun stuff? So
how do you embrace failure?
I ask people to tell me about
How do you embrace failure?
I think about what I learned from stuff that I fail at. So every time something doesn't go as expected, rather than sit around and eat Ben and Jerry's and beat myself up, I kind of say, okay, what did you learn from that? What would you do differently next time? And take care to implement those things and just not spend time dwelling on it is how I try to fail so that I make sure I learn something every time it happens, which is inevitable.
I would think that would cause people to take more accountability for their failures as well, as opposed to, so that wasn't my fault.
That's also what I look for in the answers. If someone were to say, oh, it was all this person's fault, or I didn't, like, you can tell a lot from the way that somebody chooses to answer that question. So I find it pretty insightful. Yeah. And I think you're right. Accountability is key because those disinclined toward it will not frame their answer such that you can tell what they learned or what their role in it was.
When assessing candidates for, to come in or to move around, be it in your current position or you were in the banking industry before, do you actually give them tests? Like, do they write kind of like exams?
No, so in the interviews that I do, I would ask those questions verbally.
Okay.
For some roles for which I do not directly hire, we do have technical assessments, but that's more coding, kind of that sort of stuff. Written for competency based, no. No.
Yeah, I'd imagine the technical does need to be technical.
Exactly. Administered by others than myself. Yeah.
How much in-office work is happening right now for you guys? Let's start with Canada. How much in-office work is happening?
It depends on the department, but we do collect some data on this. So on average, we're seeing people probably come in 1 to 2 days a week. And we're seeing, without being told, many teams gravitate towards this idea of agreeing on a day that they come in per week so that they have the benefit of that in-person time and then the flexibility to work elsewhere, wherever they feel like it. So our Canadian presence is about a third sales and 2/3 engineering. Okay. And so the engineers would come in and meet together for things like if there's a product delivery that they're working on, sometimes they find benefit in collaboration. Whereas our sales folks,
so a product delivery, I feel like a lot of these concepts need to be unbundled for the average.
Okay. Like a software
product
release.
Delivery. Exactly. I was thinking that.
Yeah. Release
like
of
either
new
an
software,
upgrade.
a new app, a new upgrade, or a patch on an existing piece of software or whatever it is they're seeking to deliver by a certain date.
Okay.
There can be some collaborative advantages especially when you're testing for things like bug fixes and all of those. How do you delete the errors, if you will, in the code before it goes live? There's some good gains to do some of that stuff in person. Whereas our sales teams, they're fine meeting maybe once a month in person and spending more of their time with customers, which actually gets at the outcomes that we want.
Sure.
So it really depends on the function, but we haven't mandated anybody to come to the office a certain amount of time. So it is at their discretion. Nope.
Do you see that happening? I know from our separate conversations you have, and I agree with it, a very strong opinion on hybrid work and optional hybrid work.
This is me speculating and not based on Microsoft insider information. I think some departments, for example, ironically, our legal department has said, hey, we'd like to experiment with 3 days in the office per week, which was publicly announced. And I feel like that's going well. For the other functions, no mandating. So far, the data is still telling us that it's more advantageous to choose key intervals where you bring a team together. Like my team, it may be 3 times a year for that real in-person, get some specific things done together. And that's still enough to generate the relationship and inclusion capital, sort of what we were talking about a little bit earlier, to sustain the levels of productivity that you want throughout the rest of the year. So I don't see us going back in office.
For me, and I have a very strong opinion on the fact that unless there's some logical reason why you physically need to be there, can't really operate remotely or, clean someone's teeth from a different location, people are going to do better where they're happier.
My personal opinion agrees with you wholeheartedly.
Yeah. I'm personally far more productive not driving to work, not straightening my hair in the morning, not sitting in traffic, not having to go for a walk for an hour and a half to get lunch, when I can take 15 minutes and go to the kitchen. And again, I'm so much happier.
And to keep on our theme of diversity and inclusion, a lot of demographic groups have said the same thing. For example, neurodivergent people say, hey.
Okay, so what's a neurodivergent
meaning
person?
It could be someone with autism. It could be any of those kinds of things that mean perhaps a different learning style or a preferred communication style, which means working remotely, there's much more control over how they take in interactions from other people. You can schedule time, you can message someone and ask to connect, versus sometimes that well-meaning stopping by the desk conversation can be super disruptive to folks that are in the zone or trying to do their best work with some of those things. And so there's like you said earlier, you kind of solve for one thing, which is flexibility, but you also end up solving for many, many other things that make people more productive by allowing them to work when, where, and how they work best.
I also found that the social time that I spent, I all worked in big offices, and first thing 45 minutes of your day is gone because I made coffee and then I was talking to someone, and next thing you know, it's 9:45. I don't want to say I ever really resented those conversations, but sometimes they came at a bad time. So yeah, I did resent them, and you don't want to be rude. But now I really enjoy socializing with the people I work with because it's done at a time where I can do it. I have gotten more comfortable with my law clerk and associates here have video calls when we need to have them. And I find it's extremely more productive. I had my first last Thursday, was my first time actually in court since 2019.
Wow.
We didn't have to go. It was optional. So I decided to go mostly because I found out the guy on the other side was going. Out of about 18 matters on the list, I believe we were only one of 2 that showed up in person. So there was a big screen with all the faces of the lawyer. They have a huge screen in the courtroom. And it did not seem odd to me. If you had told me 5 years ago that that's how it would be done, I'd be like, oh, that's not going to work. But it seemed incredibly efficient. The judge did not seem lost or struggling with communications of counsel, with organization of documents, with the assistance of the registrar. Everything went incredibly smoothly. Honestly, I almost felt like us two as the in-person people were the biggest hiccup.
And to get a little bit tech nerd on you, you would now, instead of a transcriber for all the notes, you would now have automated options for transcription of the entire proceeding if you do it digitally, unlike in person, unless you recorded it. It's kind of neat.
Don't think that the courts have used a manual transcriptionist in quite a long time. I think it's
I would not know. It's what you see in the movies.
No, they don't. The benefit to the registrar being there is for the physical transfer of documents, which I do think is important. I mean, because the judge was very focused, was very on the ball, took a lot of notes, seemed quite diligent in reading the materials, and seemed to have a good familiarity with each of the files as they got called up. So I do think that paper documents have not completely gone off the tracks now. But I will admit, when I decided that I was going that morning, there was some printing going on in here because I haven't printed out briefs in a long, long time. We send them over, we share screen. The court filing process to me now is incredibly more efficient than it used to be.
That's great.
Yeah, all of which I'm hoping stays this way, and I think it would.
I don't believe there's any going back. Sort of the people who are trying to have the conversation of, will it go back to what it was? I don't think that's a thing. No. Personally, it's changed for good.
What are you seeing in other countries? Do you see, so outside of Canada, I know you have some clients in Asia. Mm-hmm. Are they a lot more in office now or no?
No, I would say it's the same thing. There is definitely the phenomenon of FaceTime, but it's more what you described, which is depending on who's going to be there or what we're trying to accomplish, or is this an important opportunity where I would show respect, say, by coming into the office because of who is visiting or what we're trying to do. So there is that. But I think people also are just appreciating the flexibility because we have so many digital tools and it just makes their lives easier too. So I was there. I was in Singapore a couple of months ago for an offsite, and that was amazing because it was a week-long meeting of people from disparate geographies who have only seen each other in 2 dimensions. And really the value of it was to develop a bit of a strategy for HR in the region and some things that were just far easier to do when everybody's at their best because no one's in a different time zone. That's possibly the only dark side is if it's virtual, it's often somebody's nighttime or early morning or what have you, which is why I think it's great to come together periodically for those critical things. And then you can once again disperse to where and how you work most effectively. So I think these trends are globally holding pretty true.
Good.
Based on what we're seeing from people.
I would think it's really helping with productivity. I was on not-for-profit board of directors for a number of years. And, being that we were volunteer directors and, et cetera, we would do, like when we were working on like our strategic plan or when we were doing different things, we would hire a facilitator and, sometimes do like little retreats. I found them incredibly effective.
That's
incredibly
great.
Effective.
What were some of the things you loved about it in particular?
Well, we were really able to just drill down. Like at one point, I think we spent a day talking about who is our client. And everyone thought it was a really simple answer because everyone had their answer, but no one had the same answer. There was about 4 or 5, and we're like, oh, right. Like, it was an animal welfare board. So, mine, I'm like, the dogs are our clients. And someone else is like, well, no, the donors, the people who are funding this, the community in general, because that's who we're providing the service to. So it was really, and I think our facilitator did a good job. At the end of the day, there was no wrong answer, but it helped to examine sort of the obligations that we had to each of those different interests.
I love that. A good facilitator can definitely get those out.
Because we had board meetings. We had monthly board meetings, and we talked about it a lot. But I found that the retreats, when we got together and really dedicated a period of time, were far more efficient. And I think that would apply literally across the board and, in different disciplines.
I think you're right. As when we plan the times that I mentioned getting together in person, it is far more intentional and planful with goals, and even to the point of exercises to help a group of people move through those goals in a meaningful way, given how precious the time together is and how, as you just said, you can meet all the time, but without that level of intention around what you're after, it's far less effective. So it's more about the intention and the time versus just the time in person that tips the scales.
I agree. Really limiting and focusing it. It also made me want to be there more as opposed to, if I'm forced to be there. But I think that's not really much of an insightful comment. I think that would be agreed upon.
I think that's a neat comment, though, because it speaks to how to get the best out of your time together. When I used to do offsites early in my career, it was okay. We're going to get together, we're going to talk about this, but it wasn't, we took it for granted. So it wasn't quite the same care into how to make it effective. And by contrast, the offsite I was just at in Singapore, we wanted to develop the region's vision. We did a visualization exercise and a component around storytelling to really kind of get people into the right mind frame. And just the feedback we received on the emotional connection people were able to have with the experience and therefore the value they felt out of it was just much, much higher versus some more traditional ways of doing things.
And so you were comparing your on-sites now when everyone's mostly working remotely versus your on-sites when you were in the office every day.
That's
and then now. Yeah, I see that a lot.
Big
I can
difference.
agree with that. Well, I think it's clear where you and I stand on this. Do you see a lot of people, again, whether you're transferring them or if you hear people coming in, that make their acceptance of a role contingent? I'm interested in this job, but only if it's remote or only if it's at least hybrid 3 days a week.
Yes, I do.
You're vigorously nodding at me right now.
I do see that. And in fact, I had a call from an esteemed colleague from a prior organization that I worked at that shall remain nameless a couple of weeks ago who said, hey, I'm concerned that while the company's policy now is just a couple of days a week, I'm hearing that they plan to increase it. And their point of view was, I think that's going to compromise my life, not increase my effectiveness, and I'm not into it. So it is making talent who really value that flexibility make different choices. Yeah. And I believe employers who don't think that's happening are a little short-sighted, and good luck. They're going to find themselves on the losing end of the talent war.
I think it's a bit naive to think that all of a sudden you can show someone a different lifestyle and then be like, okay, we don't need to do that anymore.
Like you said, for no demonstrable benefit for that person.
One of the lawyers I worked with for a number of years a while ago was a lawyer she's Japanese. She was a lawyer in Tokyo for a number of years before coming over and completing her degree in Toronto and working here. And she talked about how a lot of the firms there, you don't have an office. The firm has 14 desks or whatever they decide that they need. And if you're going to come in one day, maybe say 14 desks for 24 people or whatever, come in one day, pick one. Just take one that's empty. And because her firm was like, why would we pay for all of this extra space? Because I imagine if you're looking at cost of running a business, number one, salary, number two, office space.
I think that's right. I was seeing that even prior to COVID was just this shared office space idea. And it could be what you described or a simple sign up for a workstation. If you're going to come in that day, you have modular little cupboards for your papers and your stuff and a locker, and that's it. So
exactly,
that worked pretty well too. But then we all went home and never came back.
Random question, just your opinion. The switch to a hybrid work environment, a remote work environment, has been by far the biggest change that I've seen. I mean, I've been in my professional career for about 16, 17 years. What's next? Environment, atmosphere. I admit it's probably going to be hard pressed or a while until something, radicalizes us like this has.
What's on my mind is a bit more of a macro trend versus styles in which individuals work. And it's a bit of reading I've been doing, but this idea of where people who work for companies don't agree with decisions that their governments are making or feel that other institutions that they've looked to for things like whether it's equality or racial justice or environmental advocacy or whatever,
So just a question, when you say they're governments, like literally like the government of Canada or like the company's government?
Literally the government.
Okay.
External
Got
government
it.
that we would have looked to, I think, in the past for certain supports, advocacy, rights, benefits, these kinds of things.
Okay.
Is sort of the rise of the employer or expectations that the employer will fill in these gaps. And so I'm going to pick a recent example in the United States because it's an American company where this whole stuff around an anti-trans legislation, because it's a hot topic right now, and where companies, and Microsoft is a good example, stepped up and said, irrespective of what the government says, we will offer our employees gender-affirming care, full stop, even if that involves travel to other states or whatever that looks like.
Fantastic.
But it is, and also an example of where employers, I think, need to step into, whether it's that or sustainability, sort of a depth of non-traditional advocacy roles for rights of people that we would have thought, I think, in past that governments would be doing, and they're either not doing it or they're undoing it, or whatever the situation is, which is super interesting.
Well, on that, and I can't remember, I think there's a number of companies on abortion, when this unfortunately was reversed, asked backwards a little while ago, there were some companies that saying, we will pay for our employees to go out of state or wherever they need to go.
Yeah, it's just the age of companies doing what the government doesn't seem willing or able to do, which is fascinating to me. And I see that driving a lot of employment trends because the flexibility, yes, but also you can choose a company now that aligns with who's creating your values and the future of the world as you would want to see it, which is a lot of pressure on companies, but I think a neat opportunity to rise to that occasion for companies too.
I did some research, and probably not enough to talk about it in depth right now, but into ESG and reporting, and how I believe it's starting next year that banks are going to have to start reporting on their corporate clients' pollution rates and how much money they're investing into sustainability across all three topics. All three segments of that.
I saw a little bit of that.
The social and the environmental and the governance as well.
Good.
I think that might have to be a topic for another day, because I need to go back and do some of my reading before. But this fascinates me.
Likewise. And Microsoft, again, to a little ahead of the curve, has their publicly available reports for said research, but around both addressing racial injustice and sustainability, and work not only on ourselves and our own carbon footprint and operations, but also implemented requirements for suppliers and partners of the company, similar direction to what you just described. It'll be really interesting to see the effects.
Because we're at a point now that you can't say it's not happening.
I would hope not.
How many things were canceled in the past month or 6 weeks because of the smoke?
I was talking about this with someone the other day. I've never experienced that here. Even my children's soccer, due to air quality advisories, and it smelled like a campfire out your front door, is when I said, people, the metaphor has become reality. It's on fire.
Crazy.
It is crazy.
It's crazy. I was away, and the week before I flew in, I read The Spectator and The Star, going online, where it was talking about do not exercise outside. It's like, what Twilight Zone is going on here?
It's frightening a little. And so I'm all for these directions that require that kind of accountability, because I think we've tried the appeal and the moral, it's the right thing to do. And now we're at the phase where what's next to make people take it seriously.
Exactly. Kate, thank you so much for your time today. I've loved this conversation. And like we said, I feel like we left a number of points. I want to look into that, and we need to bring this back. So maybe we can do that in a couple months.
Thank you for having me. And hey, if we do that, I promise to bring some more future of work insights, because it's definitely a burgeoning kind of research practice that we've got going on. So I'm keenly interested in, for sure.
And it's not really a company that isn't dynamic. So I'm sure a lot of people are quite curious at, what Microsoft has on the go.
For sure. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Kate.
Have a good one.